I'm not anticipating death will stop me. I fully anticipate continuing to make movies after death. I'm joking.
What's up, Fever Dreams? I'm Jaden. Today I want to talk about Clive Barker. So full disclosure, when I set out to make this video, the intent of it was very different. The original plan was to do more of a deep dive on all the corners of the horror genre that Clive Barker had managed to stick his hands, and definitely paint him in more of a Hollywood big shot sort of light, not out of cruelty, mind you, but more as a direct response to both sides of the ongoing should Clive Barker make a Hellraiser reboot or shouldn't he debate. But the more research I did, the less those original presumptions held weight. See, I could find plenty of haters, plenty of articles that were ranting about specific Clive Barker things, but most of them were either opinion pieces or didn't actually have any sources. And more than a few of them were taking someone else's record of what someone else had said that Clive Barker had said and sort of run with it. So instead, this video has sort of become a extrapolation of lacking context, an analogy for why you should always do your own research and form your own opinions, and a personal attempt to battle my own mounting cynicism when it comes to successful creators.
Whether it's been working in theater or painting, film, obviously, novels, poetry even, it's the imaginative element which I hope distinguishes the Clive Barker work.
In our modern society, we've become a bit jaded in our perceptions of the Renaissance man. The term no longer really evokes images of passion or a love of the art so much as it does a cold, profit-driven automata that is endlessly chasing the hustle and the grind. The once heavily romanticized partnership of creation and exsanguination has now almost become synonymous with the normalization of the concept that if you aren't working yourself to death, then are you really working? And if you're not ever chasing that bottom dollar, then you must be some sort of lazy. The idea that someone might do something simply for the joy of it, that a creator might create simply because they love creating or have a passion for the craft, is more or less relegated to the same graveyard that tends to spawn bumper sticker platitudes. It's a ghost of a bygone whimsy that no one believes in except the very old and the very young. We are bombarded with claims of authenticity coupled with imagery that is entirely detrimental to that particular view. Saying you do it for the music and then turning around and making decisions that are clearly exclusively profit-driven is something that's so common that it becomes all too easy to just run with the narrative that anyone who is successful in a modern media standpoint must be a money-grubbing Hollywood big shot, or music big shot, or whatever industry they're in sort of big shot. These narratives have become so increasingly popular that it's almost an inherent assumption that if someone is financially successful in the work they choose to do, they must be this product-driven entrepreneur rather than a creator who made good work and got lucky. I think that's the narrative that I fell into with Clive Barker. I've always been a fan of Clive Barker's written works. The books, the comics, the short stories. The movies have always been a little hit and miss with me. The first Hellraiser I loved. The other ones exist. But my opinion of his personality, at least the facsimile of personality that I could equate from an accumulation of admittedly biased sources, wasn't positive. What we're going to do is break down this analysis into 5 major parts. Each of these 5 parts represent an assumption that I had about Clive Barker. I am going to basically break down why I was incorrect in my assumption or why I continue to hold that assumption. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll have enough information to form your own well-thought-out opinions. This is long, so the video is going to be broken up into 2 parts. I'm releasing one this week and one either next week or the week after. It kind of depends. But anyway, without too much further ado, Part 1. Clive Barker makes shit content. Obviously, there's a degree or two of subjectivity that comes up when we're talking about whether or not someone makes good content. Whether or not it's something that interests you, whether or not the messages it's trying to send are messages that you believe in or agree with, whether or not you find it entertaining, and one that I take fairly seriously, whether or not it succeeded at being what it wanted to be. It's a fairly objective fact that Clive Barker's IMDb page is littered with absolute dumpster fires of films, and whether or not you enjoy them does not make any difference to the fact that if you watch them and you like them, much like I do with many of my favorite films, you know they're not great. They might be cult classics or personal favorites, but objectively speaking... But when talking about creators, the best place to start is at the beginning. So, Clive Barker was born in Liverpool in England in 1952, which is the same year as the first mechanical heart implant into a human being. While in school, he took a liking to theater and eventually made his own theater group called the Dog Company, which included himself and several other actors he met over the course of his studies, including Doug Bradley and a few others that will show up here and there in his films to come. He also took to writing fairly young and tried to make a living of it, though for several years, by his own admission, it was not particularly successful. He's been an openly gay man for most of his life. A lot of his writing does include characters that aren't straight, even having a few appearances of individuals that are outside the gender binary or asexual. There is something to be said that most of these characters are demons, but also the demons in Clive Barker's work are kind of the best characters, so... read some of his work and decide for yourself what you want to take away from that. Eventually, some of his stories were picked up for films, and that didn't go according to plan. Now, of course, whenever a piece of media is interpreted or adapted for another style of media, there are inherent changes that are going to happen. This is just sort of how it works. You can't take a book and make an exact replica and have a good movie, as much as we all wish that that were the case sometimes. But here's the thing, for this first adaptation, it not only wasn't what Barker wanted a film version of his story to be, it was pretty much directly shitting on the concept of the original. This is all important because through the course of Clive Barker's not small body of work, there are a few things that keep cropping up. Most notably, that most of those terrible films by Clive Barker that I had associated with him, because his name was on them, didn't actually have all that much to do with Clive Barker. Take, for example, perhaps his most notable body of work, the Hellraiser franchise. This is not a deep dive into Hellraiser, that is its own video, it's coming, I got you. Of the, at time of filming, 10 Hellraiser films, only the first one was directed by Barker. Only the first two were written by him, and after the fourth film, he had nothing to do with the franchise. And even Bloodline, the fourth film, had undergone so much manipulation at the hands of big media and the corporations backing the film that the version that went to screen is nothing like the original version. That's a lot of shit movies that have his name on them that he didn't actually have any hand in. So, just to put that into numbers for you, that's a 10th of the series that he directed, a 5th of the series that he wrote, and debatably 2/5 of the series that he even had anything to do with. Yeah, but Jaden, they're based off his books, right? He created the books, and that's what the movies are based off of. And to that I say, The first movie is based directly off of The Hellbound Heart, and if you watch the movie and read the book, you'll note the movie is almost scene for scene accurate to the book. But the further into the franchise you get, the further the characters get from their original sources, the storyline, the principles, the morals of the original storyline are completely convoluted, to the point where I don't think if you read Hellbound Heart and didn't watch the first Hellraiser, you would really connect them. Like, if you picture the last season of Game of Thrones, that's about how far off the mark from the original source material we are in the Hellraiser franchise, just to give you a ballpark. Okay, but what about Nightbreed? That movie was a bit of a dumpster fire, and that was written and directed by him. So, it's gotta be all his fault that that movie was kinda trash. Like, it's no secret that Hollywood is pretty much actively against the existence of the horror genre, and it seems like Nightbreed got some of the worst examples of this treatment. The original runtime of the film was 2 hours and 22 minutes, and that was cut down to 1 hour and 42 minutes. That's 40 minutes of this film that Fox just decided to scrap. And this dismissal of so much work actually caused a lot of people working on the project to leave and refuse to continue the project itself. And following that, when the film was given to beta readers, it was fairly poorly received because no one could follow the story. Maybe because you cut 40 minutes out of the movie. So Clive Barker, or Fox, unsure which, decided to change the ending. And then on top of that, when it was released, the marketing for the film was completely misleading, presenting it as a slasher film as opposed to this fantastic exploration of Clive Barker's universe. Add to that the fact that the studio refused to cast any known stars, expressly told Clive Barker that they were against the fantasy and horror elements. Why did you get Clive Barker then? I don't know. Told him that despite him being contractually obligated to present a R-rated film, it was too violent, and refused to screen the finished film to critics because people who watch horror movies don't read reviews, and you've got a movie that really can't do anything but fail. So yeah, Nightbreed might have a very convoluted plot and kind of lack a lot of soul, but you can still see some of the elements that could have been something amazing. The idea at the time of the monsters being the sympathetic characters and humanity being the vicious evil ones, while overdone now, at that time could have been monumental. Not to mention that you can still see some of Barker's horror brilliance shine in both the character design, mind you, the special effects were not what we are accustomed to today, and in the score, which I will at some point do a video because Clive Barker's secret weapon is his scores, and I have never seen a Clive Barker thing, or played, or any of that didn't have great music. I don't know. And it's never talked about, but it's there. It's a fact. You'll see. If you look for it now, you'll see. But so yeah, Nightbreed might have been a disaster, but how much of that actually falls on Barker? And how much of it falls on As far as the comic books go, I haven't read them all. There are a lot of them. But it really does seem to be a bit more of a is it your thing or not sort of situation. Whereas with films, even if they're good or bad, there are certain implementations you can identify to decide if it's good or bad. With the comics, it's not that easy. The visuals are stunning and very clearly Barker-esque. A lot of the designs are fascinating. The writing is fine. It really does come down to whether or not the stories being told are something you're into. As far as I'm concerned, when it comes to this medium, there's no question that Clive Barker excels at putting what he sees in his mind on the page, and it's fascinating. It's a similar situation with his books. I find them to be enjoyable and well written, and I do think he is a master of description and quite literally a master of horror. But if the books aren't something that you like, then it doesn't matter if it's well written or not. If you don't like graphic violence or gore or intense horror or horror using itself as a way to open discussion about taboos and the state of society, then you're probably not going to be a big fan of Barker's writing. I like it objectively. I think he's a fairly decent writer, certainly better than other far more popular writers that I've read. Bear in mind that he also incorporates imagery, representations, and themes regarding different aspects of the LGBTQI community and the difficulties and experiences that people from that community face on a day-to-day basis, and I'm hooked. This is the point where I should add that Clive Barker's work is very, very gore-centric and dark and by and large intended for adult audiences. He has made some very well-received children's literature, but any potential consumer should be forewarned before they look up Clive Barker stuff, what exactly they're getting into. It is very heavily rooted in grotesque romanticism and fantastique. There's a lot of graphic violence and gore and discussions of the taboo and depictions of things and realities that some more sensitive readers or viewers might not be able to stomach. So use caution if you intend to look some of this up and that's not really your thing. So yeah, final results. Clive Barker's name is on a lot of shit stuff, but by and large, most of that shit stuff didn't actually have anything to do with him. Clive Barker is really more of an idea man, and those rare and fleeting moments where he manages to keep a hold on the reins do tend to shine. There's also something to be said for the fact that I think a lot of his work did suffer from limitations on technology at the time. As far as conceptualization, storytelling, visuals, he's a bit of a genius, unless I'm forgetting something. Oh yeah, the video games. I've played Clive Barker's Undying. I have not played Clive Barker's Jericho, so we're gonna tackle Undying first. Clive Barker's Undying, and yes, that is the actual full title, was written by Clive Barker and developed by EA Games in 2001. It was released for the Unreal Engine. The visuals by now are very dated, and the controls are clunky at best. There's a heavy emphasis on cosmic horror that does lend itself well to a few creepy moments throughout the beginning of the game, but by the halfway point, both the story and the gameplay has become repetitive and frankly boring. The mechanics of the monsters are pretty easily recognizable and repetitive, which makes every fight either too easy or annoyingly frustrating, without really much of an in-between. And despite the fact that the game is largely story-driven, once you start losing interest in that story, the game doesn't do anything to rekindle your fascination or even try to nudge you back into it. All in all, I would probably describe Clive Barker's Undying as good enough, I guess. All in all, the monsters are kind of mundane, and the story is mundane. And mundane, even if I didn't like Clive Barker, isn't really a word I would ever use to describe his style most of the time. I still have not played Clive Barker's Jericho because despite progressively and increasingly masochistic tendencies, I do still have limits. While the story sounds somewhat interesting and the characters and monster designs do seem to carry that delicious Barker aesthetic, the gameplay seems less than stellar. Since I haven't played the game, I've linked a couple of video reviews of it down below, so check out those guys because I used their videos as references. So while you're down there, hit the severed hands, comment, subscribe, all the big YouTube things. It really does help. One of the interesting mechanics of Jericho when it came out was that it centers on a squad of people, and you, as the player, could swap between these people, and each of them were intended to have different skill sets and designs that helped you get past different fights while having basically your pick of a playstyle. But despite this, all of those characters that you can switch between seem to have a significant lack of any real differences between one another. Everything's gun-based, most of the guns are automatic. Any actually unique abilities they have are kind of irrelevant and not really useful in the actual gameplay. And while the visuals might be good, the actual progression of the story seems meh. Excellent soundtrack, though. All in all, it seems like another example of Clive Barker taking on a project that he doesn't necessarily have the technology or resources to accomplish at the time that that project was undertaken. So, does Clive Barker make shit content?
My first responsibility is to the thing which is that is waiting to be expressed.
I think my opinion after this section of research was that Clive Barker is a genuinely gifted man who is legitimately more concerned with the vision over the practicality of the medium, the resources needed to acquire that, or the arbitrary red tape that most industries will put down on creators nowadays. And in mediums where vision is the primary motivator, this is something that gives him a leg up and he really does excel at. But in industries that rely more heavily on financial backing, and in turn take some of the control away from the original creator, in places where the bottom dollar is the motivation, like big Hollywood or video game companies that not only require significant amounts of finances, but also experts in the field and an understanding of the newest, most up-to-date technologies, which don't always exist for the project you're trying to make, it's really anyone's game if what Clive Barker tries to make turns out well or not. Which flows us directly into part 2. Is Clive Barker more concerned with the artistic vision or monetary compensation? Because our previous section sort of required us to run with the narrative that Clive Barker's decisions and the decisions of the parent companies were somewhat at odds, Barker being more bound to the original vision and the companies being more bound to the dollar. This goes back to the concept I was talking about earlier, that toxic productivity and intense capitalism, particularly here in the US, have so ingrained themselves into everyone's day-to-day workings that the idea of someone not doing something to embrace the hustle is almost alien, especially when the person in question is perfectly happy and willing to undergo substantial, ludicrous amounts of work to meet their goals. But having watched a simple level amount of interviews of Clive Barker in the last week or so, I honestly don't believe that that narrative suits him. Honestly, after all the research, I've come to the conclusion that Clive Barker's main focus really is the art. The creation of worlds, the telling of stories. To a point where the potential financial gain or loss of something is really more of a hindrance than anything else. And that in more than a few cases, this concept of viewing the art's value in whether or not it will bring in capital is intrinsically detrimental to his style of creation. And I hear you. It's easy to go, oh, I don't care if it makes money when you have money. And that is a fair and valid point. He does have money. But what's not easy is going from doing sex work to make ends meet to having a net worth of $12 million and not get caught up in the public eye, and also not care about the money at that point either. It's easier not to care about money when you have it. It's less easy not to care about money if you've ever not had it. Clive Barker has not only voiced disdain for a lot of these productivity mindsets that Hollywood tends to push, but there's more than that. He expresses a love of horror and the fantastique, and an intrinsic core belief that the heart of horror should be to tell the difficult stories, to ask the hard questions about life, about society, about ourselves. And you can fake a lot of things, but that glimmer, that euphoric high people get when they're talking about something that they actually care about, that's not one of those things. If you're trying to get by creating something just because you love to create it, or you're putting off a project that you feel really passionate about because you're not sure if it'll end up making you money, just make it. Nothing shines through a work more than how much the creator cared about that work. Anyway, I post new videos here every Wednesday. I stream on Twitch on Tuesday, Thursday, Sundays. Like, comment, subscribe, show some support. I link my Patreon down below as well as all of the sources that I used for making this video. Thanks for coming by. See you next time.
Power to the person who says, I want to have a go at it. They've got to be prepared for disappointment and, all the things we were talking about before. But, if you take those things on board and you're prepared for that, well, man, go for it. It's never what you want it to be, but you keep after it. It's the quest beast. It's always just out of sight. It's always just around the corner. And that's what gets you up in the morning.